Hello, everyone. I've never used this thing, so I hope I'm doing it right. Okay. Oh, hi. Someone said hi. Okay, that's good. I hope you can hear me. I'm a little bit nervous. But hopefully it is good. All right, awesome. Okay. Is the button with the screen how we share our screen? I mean, I'm guessing, but it's not, there's no information on this. Yes, it is. Okay. We will share our entire screen. That's going to be deception here. Okay. And then does this appear as big for you guys, or is it really small? Just trying to figure out how this works. Okay. So I'm going to go. I'm going to paste this in the chat in case you haven't gotten it yet. It's decent. Okay. I'll be honest, I've never used Hopin, so I don't know if there are like specific things I should do to make it bigger. This is not, I'm used to Zoom. But hopefully you can see enough. So this link I just shared, actually, you know what? This is probably not the right link to share. I should probably go and get this link right here. I apologize. Okay, so forget the first link. Look at the second link. I have posted a few things on there that we'll be using. So today we're going to make a quick website, 45 minutes. That's going to be tough. I'll be honest with you guys. When I make a website of this size, I normally do it over the course of 5 hours. So at least when I'm teaching this. But I have listed a few things. So CodePen, this is what I'm going to use to do the demonstration. And if you want to follow along, I do advise having a CodePen account. I also listed the code base that we'll be using, and then obviously the different assets that we're going to use. I also posted some additional resources that we won't be needing per se when we're going to create the project, but they're there if you want to have access to them. And then, okay, this is going to be a little bit weird because I can't see both this and share my and like my screen. So I guess we're gonna, okay, it is 8. So I will quickly say that we're going to be working on the website, and then I've practiced it a couple of times, so we should have maybe 10 minutes at the end for questions, and for anything that is not answered during that time, or if you have additional questions or anything like that, I will be a mentor. I am a mentor on Discord, and I will have office hours between 9 and 11 tonight. So if something didn't make sense or you have more questions, feel free to join. I think it's on channel 2, I believe. I believe it's going to be on channel 2. So if you have questions, you can come and ask there. So with that said, I'm going to move to the other tab that we'll be using. And I just want to introduce you to the website we're going to be making today. This is my plan for today. We'll see how much we can do of it. We should be able to do most of it, if not all of it. And it's a very simple portfolio-like website that we're going to do. It's one page. So it has links that don't go anywhere, obviously, but it's showing quite a few techniques in there. And I hope that will be useful. I will say that because the time is so short, I'm going to be going through it pretty rapidly. And I'm not going to have time to, like typically when I do workshops like this, I spend time explaining syntax and key features of the language. Here, it's mostly I'm going to be coding, and I will explain what I'm doing and how things work as we go. So with that said, we're going to load our little code base here. This is the link. If you're looking for it, it's right here if you want to have it on your own machine. And here we go. And as you can see, there's already quite a bit on there, and that's so that we can survive the time constraint, obviously. So most of the HTML is actually already done. And if you've never done HTML before, you may think, wow, that's like, what is all of this? But I promise you that with the little bit that we're going to do, it should be enough for you to read this code and understand what it is and what is happening, because I'm not actually using that many elements. And the same thing here is the CSS. And there's a little bit of it already, and I will go over what that is, but we're going to be doing most of the CSS today. All right. So I think there are some moderators on the Hopin platform. So if there are questions that are like super important that need to be answered as we go, please do let me know, because I cannot see the chat at the same time, which is a little bit worrisome. But, we will do what we can. Oh, last little thing. If you are using CodePen and you are trying to do it at the same time as me, you may not have the same view. So if you have a different view and you want to have the same view, you can change the view at the top here. You go into the little section where it says Editor Layout and choose this one here. It's honestly my favorite because I can see both my code on the left and my render on the right. I can see a lot more of the render. And also I can kind of change like how big it is. All right, so with that said, let's get started. We know that in our template here, we want to have this nice little section. We need a nav bar. We need an about section. There's this little image area here. There's a portfolio section, and then a contact section, and then a footer. So the first thing we're going to code is that little intro section. And for that, we're going to create our first element in HTML, and that is a div. A div is just like a box, really. So on its own, it doesn't do anything. As you can see, nothing has happened in the render. We don't see any difference. And that's because it's just a box. It doesn't show anything on its own. And inside of our div, we're going to have a title in the form of a heading, a first heading. And I will explain a little bit what that is, like the syntax in just a sec. Let me write in hello world in there. And so we're going to pause here for just a second to talk a little bit about syntax. So as you can see on the screen on the right, where our render is, we have the words hello world. And if we look at on the left, we have a little bit more than hello world, right? We have those tags here. And this is how an element is built. We have an opening tag, and then we have a closing tag. The closing tag looks a lot like the opening tag. It just has a slash just in front of the selector. Okay, and that is how most HTML elements are made. There's another type of HTML elements, and of course we're going to see that one as well. But for now, this is what our intro area will look like. And I know it looks very different right now than it does in our example, and that's all to do with styling. So we'll we'll move on. We'll come back to that in a minute, but it's time now to build our nav. So the nav here is going to be built with another element called nav. It's essentially a div with a special name. And in there, we're going to have another div. And I'll explain why we're doing all that. Why are we adding all these elements when we get to styling? Because right now, it doesn't seem to do much for us, right? We could have just an H1. We could have just the things we're going to put in here on their own, and they would not look any different. But when we're styling, having a good understanding of the way that the layout is going to be will allow you to know how your HTML should be built. And I'm sorry to say, but this comes with practice and just time doing it over and over and over again. So here, I've done that. And now what I need to add in my navigation are some links. So we're building we're creating an anchor element here, or link element. And this one is going to be slightly different from the ones that we've done so far, because it has what we call an attribute. So the links always have an href attribute, or a hyperreference. And what that is where you're going to indicate the address. So it could be something like www.google.com, right? That would be an address. Or it could be a page. So if you're working on a website that has multiple pages, let's say you have a second page that's called about.html. So that would be, you could write in about.html. That would lead you to the next page. Or you could use an ID call. And this is what we're going to do here. We're going to call the ID intro. And I know right now you're like, what is that? And I will explain in just a minute. And then we're going to add our content and close our tag. OK, and this has appeared here. It says home. Excellent. We're going to copy this and paste it a couple times. Here we go. And I'm going to change where it's going. I'm going to change the address or the hyperreference. This one will be about. This one will be work. And then this one will be contact. And then, of course, I'm going to change the text that displays, right? So this will be about. This will be portfolio. And then this one will be contact. Okay, so why did we create this? What is this going to do? Well, these little links here are going to allow us to move around on our website. And we'll do this at the end when it's all done, right? But basically, when I click on portfolio, it should take me to my work section. If I click on contact, it should take me to my contact section. If I click on home, the goal is going to come back to the top. But right now, we're calling an ID, but that ID does not currently exist. So we need to create it. So an ID is another type of attribute. Like I said, the href, for example, is a required attribute, because otherwise your link doesn't do anything, right? I don't know what it would do, but nothing really. An ID, just like a class, are attributes that we add to help us with styling or navigation. So an ID can do styling, navigation, and it's also used quite a lot in JavaScript, while the class is mostly used for styling. So here my ID is going to be intro. That's all I'm going to do for that. All right. Now, moving on to the next little section, which is the about section. This one is also going to be built with a div. You should see like a little pattern here, like we're just creating boxes that hold things, really. In that div, actually, I should give it an ID. This one's going to have the ID of about. And I'm also going to give it a class. So a class is another type of attribute. And this one, I'm going to call it colored ground, because it's going to have a colored background. So you can name it whatever you want. It's just they have to be one word, right? You cannot have a space. You could use an underscore. You could use a hash if you want. Not a hash, a dash. But you cannot have a space. Otherwise, it will think that it's a different class, because you can have multiple classes, as we will see later. Okay. The difference between ID and class, that's also pretty important. An ID is unique. That means that, for example, the ID about can only be used once in the page. I cannot have another element later on to have the ID of about as well. It wouldn't work. And then the class, however, can be used as many times as you want. And it's very practical when you have multiple elements that are sharing the same styling, because instead of styling everything, manually multiple times, you just put it inside of the class, and then all of a sudden everything that is following that class or has that class just gets styled all at once. Very practical. Okay, so inside of our div here, we're going to have an image. And an image is one of those elements I was talking about that is the other type of elements. It's what we call an empty element, and you're going to see why in just a second. So first, we need to give it its required attributes. The image has two required attributes, the src or source. This is where you're going to put the image address. So here we're going to go and get it. It's going to be my face. If you are coding along and you have your face saved somewhere on the internet, you can use that instead. But here I'll just put in my face, and there it is. Amazing. And then we're going to add the other required attribute, which is the alt or alternative or alternate. I'm not actually sure. And here you would just describe what the image is. So say picture of me. And here is the fun thing. We are actually closing this element right there. And this little slash here that I've added is actually optional. I believe it works even without it, but it's just best practice. And also it helps letting you know that, hey, this is an empty element. So this is what we call it, an empty element. And we call it an empty element because it does not have content in between the opening tag and the closing tag. It's just one tag with the content inside or the function inside. All right, and we have my face. Amazing. So now we're going to add another element, which will be another heading. So this one will be an H2. And that's like the title of this little section. It's going to be about me. H2. And then we're going to add a paragraph. So I'm going to close my tag right here because I need to add the paragraph. And you'll see that on my little link of resources, I have this website here called Lipsum. And this is a super cool website to get placeholder text. And so here I'm just going to take 2 paragraphs. There should be 5 on there, but I'll just take 2 of them. I'll copy them and I'll come back here and I'll paste it in between my 2 p tags. So between the opening and closing tags. And I'll paste that in there. And I want to get your attention on this because as you can see, we have 2 visible paragraphs in our code, right? We see there's a space here. However, if I scroll down on my render, I only see a single paragraph. And that's important to note because HTML does not understand white space. So I could skip as many lines as I want. It's just not going to change the render at all. So there are 2 things we could be doing here to create that space that we want. The first thing that we can do is to just have two actual paragraph elements. That's one thing. Or we can use another element or tag called a break tag. And that's just written like this, BR. Again, I like to add the little slash. If you ever look at other people's code, sometimes you may not see the slash. It really depends on the person. I think it looks better, and also like it makes it clearer that it is an empty tag. I mean, yeah, an empty element, but I've seen both. And as you see here, one break tag has allowed us to come back to the line, but it didn't create a space. So I'm going to make another one. And yeah, the more you put break tags, the bigger the space will be. I think a single one is enough though. All right. And with that, we are done with the actual content or HTML. Basically, the HTML is what is holding your content. The whole content of the website is here. Now, what we need to do is to make it look good, right? And to make it look good, we use CSS. So here we go. So I'm going to bring that up a little bit just so we can see the CSS a little bit more. And let's look at what I have here. So I have a few things, like I mentioned, that I had set up ahead of time because I didn't want us to waste too much time. So I'm going to go over that real quick. Here is an import for for two fonts using the Google Font API. And I have listed their website, the Google Fonts website, in my resources. So if you want to check that out and like choose other fonts later, that's totally fine. Their website actually gives you this link. So you just paste it in and it does all the work for you, which is amazing. So that's what that does. Then we have this little asterisk here. And this is something that I do personally. I haven't really noticed anyone else doing this, but I find it's incredibly useful. So a little asterisk means everything. And so what it does is that it will select every element that you have on your website, and it will assign them those properties. So a little note, something to note is that every HTML element come with pre-styles, basically. I don't know who decides what those styles are, but they are there. And that means that sometimes it can make it difficult to get spacing right, or to make sure that everything is exactly the way that you want because of those predefined styles. So what I like to do is to reset the margins and the padding of all of my elements and set them as 0 so that I can decide what that spacing is going to be like. Margins, just for information, is the space that is outside of the element, and then padding is the space that is inside of an element. And that'll make more sense when we start using it. And then this last thing, box sizing, border box, that is something that helps with math. I'm not that great at math, and I certainly do not want to have to count pixels and percentages and all kinds of crazy. So I use box sizing to make it easier for me. And if you want to know more about that property, I have listed this website called W3 Schools. It is incredibly useful, and you can have information on every possible element in HTML, every possible property in CSS. It has things on JavaScript and Python, and it even has like how-tos for different little projects. A really cool website. Okay, and then this last thing here is CSS Variables. Because this is a hackathon, I thought it would be a cool thing to add. It's typically something a little bit more advanced that I don't normally show in my classes, but in the spirit of this event, I thought that it might interest you guys. CSS variables are really cool in the sense that when you make, let's say, 500 lines of code, which will happen when you create a website, typically you're going to use a color more than once, right? And if you use it with like your hex code, for example, at multiple places, and then you realize that, hey, you know what, I don't really like this color anymore, then you have to go back and change it at every place that you added it in. And even though there are ways to search for that in your code editor and stuff, sometimes you might miss one, and then you have to hunt for it. And imagine if you had 3,000 lines of code. That would be a nightmare. CSS variables allow us to bypass all that, because basically you just set the color right here, and then you just use that variable. And so if tomorrow I decide, hey, you know what, I don't want teal anymore, I want hot pink, I just change the hex code right here, and it will update all over my website. So that's a win for me because I'm pretty lazy and I don't want to, I hate having to go through things and look for things and just, yeah. So yeah. And then the last little things here, these are hover effects. So you probably noticed that when I hovered over my little links here, this teal background appeared and the color became white and stuff. Those are hover effects. I did code that in. It doesn't do that in nature by itself. But I wanted us to have enough time, so I put them there. And if you want to look at them and change them later to see what that does, then you're more than welcome to do so. Okay, so now with that said, we're going to make our first CSS rule. And we're going to do that on the body. So the body is this element, this HTML element that holds everything that you see in the render. We don't actually have it listed on here because we're using CodePen, and CodePen has the body already made, basically. We just don't see it. And in this body, what we're going to do is we're going to put in some properties that are going to be inherited throughout. So the first thing here is I want to change the font family to Montserrat, which is one of the fonts I got from Google Fonts. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to kind of go over the syntax right here. So this is the way that a CSS rule would be built. We have a selector. The selector can be a tag like body or div or h1. That's a tag. It could be an ID like intro, or it could be a class like colored ground, for example. Okay. Then we open our declaration. So our declaration starts with a curly bracket and ends with a curly bracket. That's very important. And then inside of the declaration, we have one or more properties and their assigned values. So the property is going to be written like this. Then you have the colon, the value or values, and then we end with a semicolon. The semicolon is super important. If you forget it, then things will break, or it just won't display the way that you expected, and then you're going to be looking for what was the problem, and sometimes it takes some time to find the missing semicolon. But yes, this is the syntax of CSS. If you know how to write the syntax, you will be okay. Obviously, I don't expect anyone to know the properties after tonight, right? That's would be crazy, but you can look at all the properties that exist on the W3 Schools website. And I should also mention something here, that some properties can be inherited. So anything that has to do with fonts, anything that has to do with color is going to be generally inherited by the elements that are the children of that element, of the element that you styled. So here you see when I put in Montserrat, it changed the font of every text that we have on this page. So everything, including what's in our footer, including what's in the work section, everything. And that's what we wanted. Now we're also going to change the color of the text. And here we're going to use a variable. And this is how you get a variable set up. So here we're calling the dark variable. And we're also going to give the background color to be light. All right. Now, we've done preliminary work, and now we're going to actually start getting things done that will make big differences. So first thing is, always look at what you're styling first. I like to work from top to bottom. So my first area of work is going to be this little section, the intro section. Here I'm going to call the ID. And the reason why I'm using ID is that if I used the tag of div, everything that had a tag of div would get those styles. And I don't want that. I only want this particular div to get the particular styles. So I use the ID, and to call an ID, you use a hashtag. And here I'm going to give it a background image. And for those of you who are following along, that will be this, the first background image here. We're just going to copy that link. We'll paste that in. Don't forget your semicolon. And you see it has appeared here. It doesn't look at all the way that you know, it did in our example, but we're going to work on that. Next thing here is we want this section to be actually really big. And the reason why it's small right now is because a div only is as big as its content, unless you make it bigger with styles. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to change the height to be 90 VH. VH is a type of measure, and it means viewport height. So now it takes basically 90% of the viewport in height. Then you see here, it looks okay, but it goes up with my with the content as I'm scrolling, and I actually want this image to stay put. So I'm going to change that to background attachment text. Okay. And now you see it doesn't. The text, everything else goes up, but this image stays in place, which is pretty cool look, in my opinion. The other thing here is that if I go like this, you see that my image changed quite a bit. And that's because this image is actually really, really big, but I really want it to be as big as my screen. Because sometimes if your image is really small, then what will happen is that it'll start repeating, and that is not a really good look. So we're going to change the size. We're going to say background size cover. That means cover the area. Looks a lot better. And now the last few things that we need to do here is to get our text to be in the center. And for that, we're going to use grid. So display grid. Grid is probably my favorite CSS thing. I just love it so much. It is so useful. And we're gonna justify the content, which is our H1, right, to be in the center. There we go. And then we need to have it be centered vertically as well. So we'll do align content center. Very good. Okay. So we're done with the intro. Now we need to look at the H1. We're not going to do very much to it, but just a little bit. There's only one H1, so I don't have to worry about the tag thing. Since there's only one, I can use the tag. It's no problem. I'm going to change the font family of it. As you see right now, it is using Montserrat because, again, fonts, anything that has to do with fonts or text is inherited. But here I'm going to overwrite that. So I will use sign mono. And you may have noticed that when I do something with fonts, I add an extra thing here. And that's in case this font does not display, I'm giving an alternate. So here I'm just saying, hey, use any monospace that is available on this computer. Then here we will change the size. So font size, we'll do 5M. M is a type of measurement unit, again, mostly used on text. And then I'm going to give it some padding of, let's say, 40 pixels. And the reason I'm doing this is that if my screen gets really small, I don't want this H to touch the side. So you see that when it gets to basically about 40 pixels, then it will, well, it won't go further, basically. Okay, and that's basically done for this little section. So we'll look at the next one, which is our nav. And I know right now it seems like, oh my God, we're taking so much time like working on this. And I will say the beginning of the styling is always the longest, because what we don't really realize is that as we're styling one thing, we sometimes are working on multiple things like below the surface. And so you'll see that as we go further, it's going to get faster. So first thing here I'm going to style is actually the anchor tag, because they're going to decide a lot of things as to what's going to happen with the nav. So first, I'm going to change the color. So color of the links is going to be links. Then we're going to have I'm going to take off that terrible underline thing. So text decoration none. Make it bold. Can't wait. 600. Okay. And I want them to be a bit more spaced out. So here we would think, okay, let's do padding 20 pixels. And as you can see, something happened, right? They got more spaced out horizontally, but they haven't taken more space vertically. And that's because elements in HTML have different displays or predefined displays. A lot of elements are what we call block elements, which take all of the space. So for example, the divs are block elements, the H1 is a block element. But then we have elements like anchor tags or anchor elements or links that are what we call inline elements. And inline elements do not understand height. So they just ignore it. And here we want that. So what could we do? If I do block, the problem is that then they will sit below one another. So what I need to do is the best of both worlds. And it so happened that there's this different display that's called inline block. And very useful. As you can see, all of a sudden, now they have a nice padding all around. And that's basically it for the anchor tag. But I do have some extra thing I want to do. I want this whole nav to be on the right. And this is why I created this little div here, because I want all these links to sit over there. And so I'm going to style this div. But as I mentioned earlier, if I write div here, all the divs on this page are going to be affected by my styles. So I need to precise what div I'm talking about. In the first div, we had an ID of intro, so I could use the ID. But here I don't have an ID. So what do I do? Well, I look at what is containing this div. And here it's this nav. And I only have one nav, so I could say, okay, nav space div, which means the divs inside of the nav. And let's do this to that particular div. So here, I want it to be display inline block again. And the reason I'm doing this is because if the div is a block element by default, which means it's taking 100% of the space. But to be able to move it in just a second, I need it to only be as big as its content. And that's what inline block allows me to do. Then I'm going to float it to the right. Very good. So you see it's moved over there. And I don't want it to be completely against the edge here. So I'll give it a margin right of 100 pixels. Pixels are, again, another type of measure unit. Okay. And so now when I scroll, that looks pretty good. But obviously, as I go further, my nav disappears. And I want to always see my nav because I want to be able to click around and go in different places of my website. So here, this is the time when we actually are going to work on the nav element itself. And I'm going to change the position of this nav to sticky. By default, everything is in static position, which means stay in the flow of the document. What sticky does is that it is static for a while, and then when it reaches a certain destination, it becomes fixed. Fixed means it doesn't move, right? So here I want it to be fixed when it reaches the top. So I'm going to say top 0. And that's how I indicate that, hey, when you reach 0 at the top, be fixed. And, oh, well, you see our links are here, but it's not displaying the way that we would think, right? We would have thought, hey, we would have this like white space here, right? But no. So there's two things that are preventing this from happening. First, the background here is actually transparent. So I need to put a background color of our light color here. And now you think, okay, well, this is fixed. Well, no, it's not. And the reason for that is because we're using a float on the child. And when you use floats, it takes the element out of the flow of the document. And so the parent collapses. So we need to prevent the parent from collapsing. And we use this little property called overflow with a value of hidden. And now it no longer collapses and we can see it. It's awesome. We're going to add a little shadow underneath just so that we can always see our nav nicely. And here I'm adding a color. It's black at an opacity of 50%. Again, normally I would spend time explaining, the different ways that you can set color, but we only have so much time. So let's move on. We're done with the nav. What's next? Next is this div with the colored background. So we're going to actually call the class. I'm going to say colored ground. And you see we call a class with a dot in front of the name. And we're going to give it a background color of, I believe it's called background 1 because I'm super imaginative. And you can call your variables whatever you like. And as we scroll down, we can see that now there's this background. I also want the color of the text to be light. I'm going to use my light color. Okay. All right. So next, I need some spacing around here. So there's a couple areas that need to have the space. The about section, the work section, and our footer, they all need some padding. And we're going to give them a padding of 60 pixels. And you see here what happens when we use padding. It moves all the elements inward, inside. Okay. That looks a lot better. The other thing that I'm noticing now that we're reaching it is that our images are actually bigger than our website, which is a pretty big problem. So we need to fix that. And here I want all the images to be affected by this change. So I'm going to say IMG to call all of them. And I'm going to give them a width of 100%. And what that does is that it constrains them to the amount of like 100% of the space that they can actually be in. So I know it sounds counterintuitive where you're like, well, not make it like as big as they can be. But no, it just constrained them, which is what we needed here. Okay, so now I need this image to be a lot smaller because that doesn't look that good. So here, I'm going to say inside the about, I want the image. So kind of what we did earlier with the nav and the div. I want this image to have a max width. It means that when it's smaller than this, I want it to be as big as it can be, but I don't want it to ever be bigger than 250 pixels. Okay, that's already more manageable. Now, I also want it to be round, so I'm going to add border radius of 100%. Okay, and I'm going to give it little box shadows just so that it pops a little bit more. And just to explain, this first 0 is the x axis. The second 0 is the y axis. The third number here is going to be the blurriness. And then the last number I'm going to add here is actually how much wider it is from the actual radius of the circle. And then I, of course, add the color. So same as earlier. Just like that. All right. And then I actually want the text to float next to it. So we'll do float left. And that's pretty good. But obviously it's a little bit too close for comfort. So we're going to we're going to add a margin to the right, which will push this text away from our image, say 40 pixels. We'll do margin bottom, and we'll do the same thing. And I thought it'd be cool to add a nice little extra thing where we will have the text actually follow the shape of this image. And to do that, we're going to use shape outside. Now, this looks a little funky. Let's change the margin bottom and do 20 pixels. That looks a lot better. That looks good. Okay, so that's it for this image. Now, I need to style this H2 here. You see it's too close. I don't like that. But I want every H2 to benefit from this, so I'm just going to call the general tag. And we'll give it a margin bottom of 20 pixels. Okay, and our about section is done. So now we're going to look on our HTML. What do we have to do next? And next is this image ground first div that is empty. This is a little section that has just an image in the background, and I'm using it to show you guys something pretty cool that's called a parallax. So here, as you can see, there's two classes. We're going to do something on the first class, which is actually used elsewhere as well. And this is just setting up some properties here. We'll do fixed attachment and need to make the size be cover. Okay. Then I want to call this other class, but in case I'm using the class first elsewhere, I want to make sure that I only want to select this div. So I'm going to precise that I want something that has both the class of image ground and the class of first. And here I'm going to give it a background image. And I'm going to go and get my image, which is the second background. Copy link. Paste that in there. And as you can see, nothing is showing up. And that's because, again, the div is empty. So there is nothing to show. So we need to give it a height of, let's say, 200 pixels. All right. And this is what I was talking about. As you see, as I'm scrolling up and down, I see different points of the image, which looks pretty cool. All right. As we go next, we have the work area. And as you can see, there's already quite a bit of styling that's been done for us, right? So that's what I was talking about. As you progress, it goes faster. So what we just need to change is the way that those little icons are displaying. And so if we scroll down on here, we see we have a div with a class of iconator. And so this is what we need to style. We're just going to give it a display of grid. And then we are going to tell it how many columns we want, which is 3. And I want them to be all one fraction of the space. Okay, that looks better already. I'm going to also change the gap, to be 40 pixels. I want some padding around, padding around to be 20 pixels at the top, 20 pixels on the right, 0 at the bottom, 20 pixels on the left. It looks better. And then I just need to make the alignment of all these things a little bit better. So we'll do align items center and justify items center. All right, that looks a lot better. Now I just need to make those icons a specific size, because right now they'll just get bigger as we make our screen bigger. So they have a class of icons, so we'll just call that class, and we'll just give them a width of 150 pixels and call that a day. Look at that, that looks good. All right, so this section's done. Now move on to the next section. This one is gonna be a little bit weird because it's kind of like an inception of divs. We have 3 divs, then an image, and then a link, I believe. Yes. So let's get started on that. The first one is this image ground second. So we've already styled image ground. We just need to add some property to the other class. So image ground dot second, and first we're going to add our background image. I'm going to go get it, which is obviously the third one, third and last. Here we go. We're going to make it a height of 400 pixels. And this one is going to have a position relative, because I want to place the green div in a specific spot over that div. Okay, and I know right now we don't see anything, and that's because this image is enormous, and we'll fix that when we get to it. So next, we have this contact ID. So we're going to call that contact. We're going to give it a position absolute. All right, I can see a little bit better now. I'm going to move it down. So the top for this is going to be 150 pixels. As you can see, it's like 150 pixels from its parent container. And we're going to make it width, 100%. I also want to have a padding of 20 pixels. All right, now we need to style the next area, which is this button. So the button, and then I promise it will actually look good. So here we're just going to use grid again. And we're going to have 2 columns. So grid template column. And the first one is going to be 40 pixels, and then the other one is going to be auto. Okay, I can see better now. That's excellent. Then I want them to be aligned vertically. So align items center. Okay, much better. I want to give it a border. So border 2 pixel solid white. Let's use our variable white. Okay, I can see it's enormous. I don't want this button to be that big, so I'm going to give it an actual size. So width to 210 pixels. Okay, much better. We're going to have a padding on the left. Padding left of 20 pixels. All right. And then we're going to round the corners. So border radius, let's do 15 pixels. All right, that looks good. And now we just need to center it. For that, we're going to use margin auto. And here we go. All right, let me save this. And now what I want to show you is how you can navigate your website. So you press home and it takes you to the top. Portfolio, it takes you to my work. Contact, takes you to contact, etc. And that is it for this class. So now I'm going to go back to the Hopin tab and see if you guys have any questions. We have about 9 minutes. What do the numbers before the RGBA call for box shadow mean? So those numbers, again, are the first one is for the x-axis. So if you want, for example, something to be 20 pixels to the right, if you want the shadow to be 20 pixels on the right from your actual box, then you would put in 20 pixel for the first number. The second number is for the y-axis, so same thing, but to go down. The third number is for the blurriness, so or softness. And then the fourth number, if you use it, is for how far away from your element the shadow is starting. Okay, next question was, how did you get my work to wrap around your image? So I'll go back to that just so you can see it. But basically what you do for that is on the image itself, right here, you use float left. And so that will float your image. But it's also very important that your image is smaller than 100%. Otherwise, there will be no space for your element, your text to float next to. All right. Any other question? Or do I need to show the page again? Okay. What is the purpose of a nav? Well, I think if you're talking about the element itself, the nav element, where is it? Here we go. The way, basically, it was created when people created HTML5. Before HTML5, we didn't have nav, we only had divs. And so what a lot of developers would do is they would have div and they would say, okay, this div has an ID of nav. And they did that, to style the nav. And I guess the people who were developing HTML5 thought it would be a good idea to have specific elements for the nav. They have a specific element for the footer. They have some for sections. They have some for articles. They have one that's a header. I think those are all the special ones, but they're basically divs. I mean, they just have a special name that allows you to not actually use a class or an ID, but that's just all they do. If your question was more, why do we need one? Well, you need one to move around. If you're just doing a one-page website and you don't want a nav, I guess you don't have to have one, but it's just going to be better for your users. Okay. So, yes. All right. So I answered the nav versus div. Then, okay, next question was, one problem that I have when doing CSS in my IDE is that I can't see the changes that I make right as I make them, which means changing the CSS means that I have to recompile, which can be slow and cumbersome, especially when I'm making small changes or if I'm experimenting. Thoughts on solving this problem? Are you using CodePen or are you using a text editor? Okay, so yes, when you're using a text editor, you're gonna have to you save, then you go back to your browser, you refresh the page. So when you're experimenting, when you're making small changes, my best advice for you would be to actually use CodePen. Whenever I'm trying something new, I just start there because I can see the changes as I do them. CodePen is free. You can create an account in just a few minutes. The only thing with CodePen is that obviously it is working within just a one page. So if you're trying to link to different pages in your project, that won't work. You also cannot link your assets the way that you normally would in a text editor. That's why, you know, when I'm using images, I have to have the full address of the image. If I'm using a code editor or a text editor, I could just put in the name of the image, and then it would, as long as they're in the same folder, they would show up. But you can't do that in CodePen. However, it's super useful when you're just like doing something like what we did today, where you're working on the fly and just trying to make sure that things work the way that you were planning. Another thing that you can also do, actually, and I should mention that because that's super useful, is if you're, let's say you did something in your text editor and now you're inside of your browser and you're not sure why something is looking the way that it's looking, the inspect command or thing that you can do by right-clicking your website allows you to actually see what's behind the scenes. So let's take an example on that. So here I'm going to be on the Lipsum website, and let's say I want to know, like, how is this styled? I can right-click, and then I'll say inspect, and then this will show up here. And as you can see, I can hover over the different HTML elements, and I can get information on them by clicking them. So you see, while I'm still hovering, I have this blue, and then I have an orange right underneath. And that tells me, if I look at the little, I can't move my mouse because otherwise we won't see this anymore. But it tells me, looking at the little legend on the right, that I have the content in blue, and then I have margin in orange. And here it's telling me there's a 15 pixel margin on the bottom, and the text is justified. And you can kind of like look around. So, and let's say you wanted to change that. Let's say I want this margin to be 35 pixels. I can click here. Oops, come on. And I can change that, and it will change on the fly right there. Now, the one thing with this is that it won't save, right? I cannot save this. But if you're trying to figure out what is going wrong, it's a really cool little tool. You can also kind of like check off the way that things are working. So that way, if you want to see what happens if you remove a class, I mean, a style. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. And with that, I believe it's time. I'm going to be on Discord in just like a minute. And so if you have more questions or that didn't answer you, then please come and talk to me. Thank you so much. You guys have a great day. Bye.